Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Clarence Lucane. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department at Howard University, and it is my pleasure today to interview Dr. Frank Smith. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Thank you.
Of the many achievements of Dr. Smith, we want to note that he was a founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC as it's popularly known, in the early 1960s. And he was a key organizer in Mississippi during that period, working alongside Ms. Fannie Lou Hamer, Stokely Carmichael, Dr. Martin Luther King, and many others. He later moved to Washington, D.C., where along with other SNCC members, such as Marion Barry, Cortland Cox, Ivanhoe Donaldson, he forged a stellar and impactful political and advocacy career. He served on the D.C. Board of Education and for 4 terms on the D.C. City Council. His activism and work coincided in the early years with the emergence of the Black Power movement, the subject of our discussion today. Welcome, Dr. Smith.
Okay, thank you. Glad to be here with you.
I first want to give you an opportunity to talk to us about how you became an activist. How did you go from being a young man in the 1940s, I believe, early 1950s, to becoming an activist?
Well, you know, I grapple with this subject myself from time to time, but let me just say it this way. I landed at Morehouse College in 1959. The Civil Rights Movement started in 1960 pretty much, the sit-in movement and things. And so at the end of my freshman year at Morehouse, before the end of the school year, I stumbled into a SNCC meeting when they were just about to do a demonstration, and opened my mouth to say something about how disorganized this thing seemed to be, and they made me the leader of that organization. So I ended up a few years later being chairman of the Atlanta Civil Rights Movement. And then after being such a while in Atlanta, I agreed to drop out of college along with a bunch of other SNCC people to form the organizing core of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I went to Mississippi, where I stayed for 6 years. So it was an eventful but interesting career. It actually shaped my life and actually formed really a basis for my motivation for the rest of my life. And my wish to young people today is that they can find their cause early in life, which will shape them, find their friends, give them an idea of something to do with themselves that they can do that's important, where they can make a contribution. And those of us who were in SNCC were fortunate to find that. And I think it's a blessing that we achieved, and also enable us to have some impact for a long time beyond our career as just organizers in Mississippi.
Well, let's go back and talk about that first demonstration. So what was that about?
Well, they were going to go downtown to picket a department store, which was not hiring any black people there in Atlanta, wouldn't let you sit at a lunch counter. You could go into they had a very expensive place over there where they sold these mink coats. People who had enough money to buy one, black people, could go over there and try one on, but they couldn't go into the dressing room. So you couldn't eat at the lunch counter, you couldn't try clothes on there, you couldn't work in the store except as janitors and stuff like that. And that was wrong for us, and because we knew that even when we finished our college careers, no matter how we comported ourselves, no matter how smart we were, how well-dressed we were, the fact of the matter, we were barred from certain jobs in Atlanta and New Orleans and in Washington, D.C., just because of the color of our skin. And so it devalued our education, and we were smart to figure that out. And once we got going, we just kept it up.
So what year was that?
1959, spring of 1960.
So this was before the very famous 1960 Greensboro sit-in.
That's right. Yeah. Well, the demonstrations were going on all of these campuses.
Right.
At the same time. In Nashville, the students at Fisk were demonstrating downtown Atlanta. In Atlanta, we were picketing and demonstrating downtown Atlanta. People up in North Carolina were picketing and going to jail too. Yeah.
Now, what I want to move to is discuss the Black Power movement.
Okay.
Now, historians and politicians, we love to have categories. We have to have boxes to put things in. So when we think about the 1960s and black activism, we think of that as 2 key movements that drove that period, the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement. Now, you have generally been seen and perhaps define yourself as a core founder and mover in the civil rights movement. But how, in your experiences during that period and since then, did the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement overlap in what you were doing?
Well, if you define the civil rights movement as a movement to try to gain what we call equal rights, equal access, that's really the better word to say it, equal access to lunch counters and to grocery stores and to jobs. Right. Pretty much those things that are covered by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution that promises us equal protection under the law. That's what the civil rights movement was about. And eventually we get the '64 Civil Rights Act, right, that repeals those some of those things. So if you define civil rights like that, yes, I was a part of that group when I was demonstrating in Atlanta and when I went to, but by the time SNCC decided to go to Mississippi, when I dropped out of college in 1962, which is really a short 2 years later, maybe a year and a half later, SNCC had decided that it was going to send full-time organizers into these places to register people to vote. At that point, in my view, that sort of Black Power side of us starts to form. Because what are we doing? We sat down in Atlanta with a map, really, and we picked counties where African Americans were a majority of the population. We didn't just walk out of there one day and go to Mississippi with a damn and decide, you know. So we sat down and because we were college students, we were smart. We could read and write, and we could read these numbers. So we deployed our staff into those places where we knew Black people were a significant majority, not just a majority, but a significant majority. When I went to Holly Springs, Mississippi, Marshall County was 76% Black. We knew that we could register some people to vote. We could take over this place, and we could stop these Klansmen from burning houses and stuff like that, because we could have somebody at the sheriff's department, in the mayor's office, the police department, and we could serve on juries. Nice. So at that point, SNCC had decided to become an organization that was going to get serious about how we were going to gain real power in these communities. And in my view, at that point, the seeds of Black Power were born.
Now, one of the vexing questions, picking up on that, is when did the Black Power movement basically kind of start? And so often they're seen as completely separated, but from what you're saying, there was a transition, and at least some parts of the civil rights movement were the birthers of the Black Power movement. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, and also the transition that happened in SNCC. Because one of the things that distinguished the civil rights movement from the Black Power movement was that the Black Power movement was Black. And the civil rights movement was clearly more than just African Americans.
Right. Well, you know, I think that was the, as what I try to describe is what I call the seeds of it within SNCC. Mm-hmm. Now, there were always people there who thought and we coexisted as an entity, as an organization, with people inside the organization who still thought our major emphasis should be on these lunch counters and on these outward things, primarily because of the employment associated with these demonstrations. Mm-hmm. We didn't just demonstrate because we were trying to buy a cup of coffee. We actually, in every one of these cases, in every one of these cities, you look at the demands that people made on these stores, the first and foremost in those demands was employment, because our people were suffering from high unemployment rates, not only just high unemployment rates, but they had us structured so we could only get those low paying jobs as janitors and maids and stuff like that, as cooks. We couldn't get the jobs that paid the money in the front office and some things, and the professional jobs. So tied to that lunch counter demonstration was also, and that's how we got the public involved in this, because the public didn't really care that much about these lunch counter things, except that it grated on them and made them mad when they had to face it every day. But what they really cared about was the fact that we were that people couldn't get good jobs because the people out in the public are concerned about making enough money to support their families, and they knew they were being discriminated against. And even worse than that, they were required in many cases to do this work of the professionals. They were still being paid as janitors and maids. They were required, for example, to do these. I never will forget this. At the Rich's department store in Atlanta, Georgia, the maids arranged all of those window displays in the store. they were classified as maids. The person who got paid to do that job was classified as some kind of a technician.
Right.
They were being paid as maids. They were doing the work, and they knew they could do it. They were the ones that came with the ideas for what this place should look like. So people worked with a kind of a rage in their heart, knowing full well that they were doing the work of somebody that should be paid more. So it made it easier for us once we could articulate what our goals were and our demands were. It made it easier for us to get the public behind us. And so we combined the sit-in movement, which disrupted the things on the surface and got in the press, with a boycott, saying do not shop at this place until they agree to open up these boycotts and hire some minority people.
Now, you raise a really, really critical point, because the issue of fundamentally, could people make a living? Could people be fairly treated, has animated black politics, and something that W.B. Du Bois talked about, even Garvey talked about, certainly the March on Washington in 1963, although it focused on these symbolic issues of segregation, central to that march was a call for jobs. Did whites who were in SNCC and more broadly in the civil rights movement understand that component of what the struggle was about? That it wasn't just the symbolism of getting rid of segregation, but that restructuring of the economic life of society was really critical as well. Right.
Yeah, and I think that that people don't understand the full impact of the civil rights movement, that they don't understand that part of it. And I run the African American Civil War Museum here in Washington, D.C. now, and I've got a graphic in the very end of our display. I have a graphic that shows you what the impact of the civil rights movement was on the black community. And on the income side, we earned like $9 billion or something like that in the 1950s. All our money together, we're picking cotton and we're working as these maids. By the time President Obama runs in 2008, African Americans earned $900 billion. The year we record that figure is greater than the GNP for Canada for that year. So African Americans have gone from one condition in 1950 to a tremendously different. And if you disaggregate those figures and figure out where did all that money come from, it mostly comes from jobs in the public sector. As African Americans take over these mayor's offices in Atlanta, Georgia, New Orleans, Louisiana, and in Washington, D.C. and others, they bring into the government with them high-paid professional black persons who can now earn a living and who can now buy houses. They can send their kids to good schools, and they can drive good cars and make a living for themselves. So you see those numbers go up, and as African Americans take over those jobs. Now this does, in the cities, it brings us somewhat in conflict with these labor unions in some cases, because many of these jobs in the city are unionized.
Right.
So you got Marion Barry, Frank Smith, others from SNCC trying to figure out how we get black people employed. And we know now we can't put all these people out, can't fire all these people. You can't just walk in there and fire everybody, because they're protected by the unions, and besides, some of them didn't really need to be fired. Some of them did, but some of them didn't really need to be fired. So what do? We have to increase the number of employees the government has. So you look at the number of employees the government had for the first several years of Barry's in office in D.C., you'll see that the number of city employees goes from like 23,000 to almost 48,000 employees. Well, ain't no need of us running for office if we can't get our people to work. What good is that gonna do? We just gonna become caretakers for somebody else. That's not a revolutionary. That's not a black power move. That's you just being a caretaker for everybody else. And so we developed the largest black middle class here in Washington, D.C. in the country. And most of those jobs are in the public sector. They're jobs as African Americans take over as mayors. If you go to Mississippi today, the mayor of every major city in Mississippi is African American, including the mayor of Jackson, Mississippi. Right. So it's had an impact on the country. It's changed it and made it a better place for black people.
Now, as you're laying this out and you're tracking this, my thinking is going back to the multiple definitions of black power.
Right.
There's black power is kind of the movement,
right,
and that has specific people who were part of those organizations, from Congress of African People to Karanga's organization, us, to people who include the Black Panthers even. Then you have black power as kind of a symbolic term, right? That everybody from Richard Nixon to
right,
Coleman Young, employed. Then you can argue that you have black power, small b, small p, that perhaps along the lines you're describing,
Right.
where people were not necessarily ideologically tied to a particular term, but what actually happened in practice. Now, you were there at the beginning. The famous march in June 1966, where Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks,
Right.
On that march, and a number of times apparently said the term black power.
Right.
Now, it had been said before
Right.
in the past,
Right.
but that's where it really became kind of a catalyst for a different way of thinking how the movement was going to be shaped. And as I mentioned, black power very much said black people.
Yeah.
So you were there.
Yeah.
What was your feeling at the time? Did you have discussions with Stokely Carmichael about this, and how did you see this evolution after 1966?
Well, I knew Stokely pretty well. Actually, he and I were in jail together in Greenwood, Mississippi in
Okay.
1963, in the
Okay.
spring of 63.
Why?
In Greenwood, we got arrested for marching some people to the courthouse to register to vote. And, he was, we spent about 3 weeks in jail together. You get to know people pretty good when you're in jail, but at the same time, makes a big difference. But, he I think, always had a militant definition of African Americans being able to control their own lives.
Right.
And you got to remember something now. Stokely is deployed in the Mississippi Delta in Lowndes County, in the Black Belt County of Mississippi. I'm in Black Belt, he's in Alabama, I'm in Mississippi. We are in places where African Americans are a large majority of the population where they can't vote because people just won't let them vote because of the color of their skin. And so, we're trying to figure out how to rally these people. And I think in this simplest definition, what it means is in these places where African Americans are a majority of the population, they should be able to vote so they can themselves control their own destinies. So that's, I think, I think that was really the intent of what he and Rick had in mind when they first put this out there.
Right.
Now the public takes it and spins it a lot of different ways. And I remember on that same march, Dr. King said something about how he thought it was bad because it essentially said they're fighting white people to say it that way. And Stokely at that point says, who cares? We got to take care of ourselves. These people killing us down here like they don't care about us. They're killing us down here.
Right.
We try to find a way to protect ourselves.
Right.
Now that's a real discussion right there. That's not just somebody who's out there that's making some kind of cavalier notion because of an egotistical idea. It was a real serious matter. We were being killed. We were on the Meredith March because Meredith had just been shot.
Right.
I mean, why were we out there? James Meredith had been shot for trying to march. He started a march against fear and got shot by some person who really wanted to stop him and stop the rest of us too, to frighten all of us, scare us all off. And so you got to remember that as part of the backdrop. Now, some other things happened as a result of this too, and that is that it came down to the question of whether, for example, SNCC was going to allow white people to continue to work, whether they're going to vote them out of the organization. And as those things started to happen, then Black Power in SNCC takes on another aspect, which is some people said we went broke by the end of the year. We were broke, didn't have any money because all the money dried up. A number of the whites who had been really a good part of the organization, who had been my friends and other people's friends, did not feel comfortable anymore, wanted to go off and do something different. And so that all that other stuff started to happen too. But taking that as face as the way this all started out and how I think it ended up being beneficial. Basically what he was saying was this is an unfair situation for African Americans, any way you look at it, because we are a majority in these places. And people won't let us vote because we are the majority. Right. And we can't get our share of the government, we can't get our share of the resources, our share of the jobs, because of the color of our skin and because these people got their foot on our necks. We got to get their foot off of our necks before we can do anything else.
Now, there's a really important point you made in here that I hadn't thought about. So certainly Dr. King supported racial equality.
Right.
Do you think he eventually, at some point, supported black community power? In other words, as you talked about Stokely's initial speaking of this term was to basically say where black people have majority, black
Right.
people should have some control over what
Right.
happens in their life. King thought that might be alienating. Do you think King moved at some point to say, okay, I really do think that particular meaning of black power really is significant, it really is important, and that he agreed with it? Or do you think he never kind of got there?
Well, I think that in the first instance, I think he probably would have gotten there if the second part of it hadn't happened. I think if
Okay.
it became clear that after a while that these SNCC meetings, I have to copy the minutes from the meetings where they voted to exclude whites from the organization.
Mm-hmm.
I think as those things started to happen, I think Dr. King was, he was not just, I don't know that he was personally committed to this concept of integration, but he was committed to one thing, which I think is, we can only be fair in stating, and that is that he knew that we needed the support of a large number of what I'm going to call well-meaning whites in order to move this country forward. That African Americans by ourselves, we are a minority in this country. Now you start saying, well, we can, in places where we have a majority, we ought to have some power, yeah. But if you go nationwide, we are a significant minority here. We're 20% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
So for us to ever get to the point where we can elect a Barack Obama president or elect somebody and most of us were living in places where we were minorities. I was living in Newnan, Georgia. Blacks were only 20% of the population. So I don't want to buy into a system where it said, okay, if I'm a majority, I get to be treated right, but if I'm only 20%, you can treat me any way you want to. I don't believe that. Minorities have to be protected too, and that's the essence of what America is about. So I think that I think that Dr. King would have probably supported the first, but it happened so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking about a matter of months, and before one thing leads to another, the press was goading him on and all of this, and so I think by the time this all got sort of spread out, it was I don't think Dr. King would have supported it because I think he believed genuinely, and he was correct about this too, that in order for African Americans to move forward, we had to keep our friends, our white, well-meaning white friends, who were willing to stand up with us, go to jail with us, in some cases get killed with us. Florida Goodman and Cheney get killed with us in order to advance the cause of civil rights and equality here in the country. And I think that was the right strategy.
Okay. Now, at some point, you, Marion Barry, Ivanhoe Donaldson, you guys all end up in Washington, D.C.
Absolutely.
Why Washington, D.C.? And how were you all able, in a relatively short period, take over the city government? Now, Washington had been around since the beginning of the country. It basically been controlled by the federal government, so it wasn't even locally controlled.
Absolutely.
So how are you guys, who, however you were perceived by black power advocates, were certainly seen by white power advocates as militant? So how were you guys able to work that system? How were you able to, both why you came to D.C. and then how were you able to eventually basically come to power?
Well, you know, now many of these people, including Barry, moved to Washington, D.C. before I did. I moved here in 1968 in January, and the public will remember this because Dr. King was assassinated in April of that year.
Right.
So I'd only been here a few months when Washington, D.C. went up in flames.
Riot breaks out.
The riot
Rebellion
breaks out.
Right.
I'm looking around saying to myself, maybe I made a bad choice here. Maybe I'm better off in the Mississippi Delta. But the fact of the matter is, at that time, African Americans in D.C. were really not much better off than they were in Mississippi. They were discriminated in the job market. There were jobs they were barred out of because of the color of their skin. That's just like Mississippi. They couldn't vote in local elections. They couldn't vote for mayor. They couldn't vote for school board. They couldn't vote for city council, just like Mississippi. They had an oppressive white regime that was the police department here in D.C., many of whom came from the South, because they had a guy named McMillan who was running the city government from South Carolina. And he was hiring his buddies from down there to be, and they were coming up here and getting on the police department because they wanted to make a career beating up black people. And so Mississippi, this place was a lot like Mississippi, except that the Klan was not as bad here as they were down there. So we could organize in D.C. And I think once the local people realized how really bad off they were and how much they were being denied basic human rights for work and basic human rights for dignity, because there were places where they couldn't shop either, and there were places where they couldn't try on clothes. So once they realized that, once we brought that to their attention and went to work on a Free D.C. movement, we were not only able to get the right to vote for council and mayor here in D.C., but also to get ourselves elected to office so we could implement some of those programs that we had talked about doing as organizers, as street organizers, militant street organizers. Now we can implement some of those programs, like the Mayor's Summer Youth Program, which Barry brought into the government with him. He organized Prides Incorporated, brought in the government. I had organized housing programs in the Mississippi Delta. That's what I was doing my last few years. I get on the city council, I introduce a homestead program which let people fix up their own houses, sell them a house for $250 a piece in the city government. So we develop a very large cooperative housing program here in the city because we want to see some of those programs implemented. And here we have an opportunity to do it. So Washington became sort of a place where we can carry out some of those ideals, and not just here, but also across the country.
What strikes me is really important for what you guys were able to accomplish and what you brought to the table. As you pointed out, you, Barry, others didn't just come to the city and said, elect me to office. Firstly, there was no office to be elected
Right,
to.
absolutely.
So you couldn't do that. But even if they were, that wasn't the path. The path was you guys spent a number of years working in the communities.
That's right.
And building programs
Absolutely.
and organizations
Absolutely.
that were able to then be translated
Right.
into the administration
Right.
when Barry came into power. Programs that needed not just to be located in neighborhoods, but really could have a citywide value.
Right.
And how deliberative was that?
Well, let me just frame this another way. So I would posit to say that at the time we run for office, Marion Barry, myself, John Lewis, and others, that we run for office as probably the most qualified group of people. I won't say black people to ever run for office. You look at some of what's going on in the country now. People are saying now, well, he didn't know about this. The first time they ever did this, he didn't know what he was doing. We knew what we were doing. Nobody ever said that about us.
Right.
We knew what we were doing. We had been educated at the best schools. I was at Morehouse, Marion Barry, finished almost a PhD. John Wilson, who was the chairman of the city council here, was a good student down in Maryland. Ivanhoe Donaldson. We knew what we were doing, and we were working hard at trying to do it. And that was that's why the public believed in us and kept electing us to office,
Right.
because the public is not stupid. They know the difference between somebody who's doing something to try to help them and somebody who's doing something to try to harm them. They know the difference.
Right.
And they know you should support one and scorn the other. So I think that made a difference in terms of us. But I wanted to say that because people might ask, well, Marion Barry was born in Mississippi. I was born in Georgia. He was the mayor. John Wilson was born down in St. Mary's County in Maryland. Hilda Mason, who was on the council with us, was born down in Virginia.
Right.
Nadine Winter came from someplace down in Virginia. You keep going. And even David Clark, who was on the council with us, had been a lawyer for SCLC, for Dr. King, and the Poor People's March. We all had a very strong background in the civil rights movement. And so, and it gave us a chance to do something here that really didn't happen anywhere else. We built the largest black middle class in the country here in D.C., maybe the largest black middle class in the world. Right. Now, many of them have moved out to Maryland and Virginia now, and they took their money, and which they had the right to do. They thought they were getting a better house and getting a better school and a better neighborhood, and which they had the right to do, because we had passed laws that made it possible for them to move into neighborhoods where they couldn't move before. Mm-hmm. That's right. So I think it made a difference, and I think it made a difference in the country. And it was healthy for America. It was certainly healthy for the black community. It made America a better place for all of us to live. I mean, for those people who never saw a sign that said colored go here and colored water and ride the back of the bus, and who never would turn down for a job just because of their skin, color of their skin. If you never experienced that, thank God for you that you never experienced it. But there are some of us still alive who still remember those scornful, hurtful days. And I'm very happy that my children and grandchildren never had to see that, because of the efforts of myself and others, many of whom gave their lives for so that those things could be taken off the landscape of America. And then, of course, to see an African American get elected president in the U.S., that just not once but twice. It's a good time.
Now, what was the relationship between the city council and the mayor with community-based organizations when you guys came in? Because part of what seems is the cocoon of protection for what you guys were attempting to do was that there was some basis in the community for that.
Right.
But the community, of course, is very diverse, and there were Black Power organizations and Black militant organizations. What was the relationship between those groups and what you guys were doing?
Well, let me say, I'm sure this was true when I was there, Barry was there, and also certainly true during the Obama administration. You never do enough for all of the people who need your help. We were never able to erase unemployment from in very high levels in Southeast Washington, for example. We were never able to get all the homeless people off the streets. And the Lord knows I don't know what happened to the public school system here in the District of Columbia. Right. We're doing some work on that now at the African American Civil War Museum by bringing kids to our museum, because we got a study that say the kids who go to museums do better than kids who do not. So I'm working at that right now, myself and my staff. But the fact of the matter is that the question is, did we move the needle forward? And the reason why I gave you that statistic earlier about the increase in income, because I think the record clearly demonstrates that this civil rights movement made a significant difference in terms of the quality of life for Black people in the United States. Not only did we just get rid of those signs that said that was so demeaning for you to see, I don't know how we ever got from Georgia to Washington, D.C. without going to a bathroom, because there weren't any bathrooms for Black people on any of those service stations down there. They didn't even have 2 bathrooms. They couldn't afford 2, so they had only 1 for whites. So what did we have to do? We had to figure some other way to relieve ourselves. And so it was ridiculous when you start thinking about it now. Absolutely ridiculous. But the country has changed, and I think it made a difference. It changed not only because of our efforts, but also because we were smart enough to reach across the aisle and find our friends in other places, in labor unions and in other organizations, churches and schools, who were willing to help us, because they believed in human dignity also and freedom, and they were willing to risk their lives. And also, at the end of the day, we end up sharing some of those resources. You say, okay, if the income in the Black community goes from $9 billion to $900 billion, if we weren't making that money, somebody else would be making it. That's some of what this current administration is trying to reverse now. What they're saying to people is, if we can get these people out of here, we can get this money back in your pocket where it belongs. So to some extent, this is a fight over money. Don't make no mistake about that now. This is a fight over money too. And it seems like we're always going to be in that fight. But we have to prepare our young people. You're doing this at Howard University now as a professor. I do it at a museum. Every parent and grandparent out there in our view is teaching their kids now the value of hard work and discipline, and how to find their friends and stay with them. Put your arms around your friends, and don't forget to hold hands. But you got to look both ways before you cross the street, because it's still dangerous out there.
Right. Yeah, we're in a dangerous period for sure, and one with a lot of anxiety. And I would argue probably some frustration with political leadership, but kind of across the board.
Absolutely.
When I think of kind of Black Power 2017, on the electoral level, I think of like Ras Baraka in Newark, Chokwe Lumumba Jr. in Jackson, Mississippi. And then in terms of sort of on the street level, Black Lives Matter.
Right.
How do you read today's wide array of Black politics, is particularly what I would call the children or maybe grandchildren of Black Power?
Well, let me say first of all something about Black Lives Matter, and that is that the civil rights movement left unresolved this issue of police brutality. This issue was around when we were around too. I just remind the public that the Black Panther Party starts out in California as a party to try to defend itself against police brutality. They weren't talking about patrolling the Black community, trying to stop somebody from the outside from coming in there. They were talking about the police department, which was really brutalizing the Black community, and that in Oakland, California, not just in Mississippi and Alabama. And when the first elective office Barry had here in D.C. was with the 3rd District Police Advisory Committee. What was that? That was before we got any elective officers here. What was that committee doing? It was holding hearings on police brutality in Washington, D.C. So this issue has been around for a long time. We just never were able to figure out how to deal with it The Muslims, when they started the Fruit of Islam, they used to have these famous marches down the street. They were talking about protecting the black community against police brutality. So this issue has been around for all these years. We have just never had a systematic way to deal with it. And I think Black Lives Matter is doing really the country a service, making the community safer by bringing this issue to the forefront now. And I thank God for them. I'm glad they're out there. I feel a little safer. I've got teenage grandchildren out there now, and I feel a little safer about them being out there because somebody's watching. And it's real important for somebody to be watching, because if ain't nobody watching, the devil can do you a lot of harm.
Right. And what about Chokwe and Ras Baraka?
Well, I knew Chokwe's father, who was there. I met with him before he actually had a fatal heart attack that killed him. And he didn't win the first time. I was glad to see him win the second time. I have not talked to him personally. I did not know him personally. I knew his father. But I'm glad to hear. I've heard good things about him. I look forward to meeting him. I'll be in Mississippi soon. I look forward to getting a chance to meet him and talk to him. Jackson is still the capital of Mississippi. It's the largest city in the state. I'm glad to hear that there's an African American there who says she's going to do something significant for his people. He has talked about this publicly. I read a lot about him trying to reduce the unemployment rate down there, trying to help with some housing matters in those communities that are really devastated. And Jackson, so I wish him well. I look forward to meeting with him, and hopefully if there's anything I can do to help, I'm in there with him.
Yeah, I knew his father as well from Detroit. His father's from Detroit, and I remember his activism around the Republic of New Africa, and then when he went to Mississippi. And for a long time, he had deep roots in Jackson and in Mississippi. But it's a real challenge.
It is.
Because in a period when we were growing up, if you look at the 60s, 70s, even to some degree the 80s, the amount of support that cities were getting from the federal government was very critical.
Right.
And provided a lot of resources to help with education, with infrastructure, with transportation. All of that, more or less died under Reagan, and basically has never kind of come back. So cities really are left on their own.
Right.
And it's, to me, always a question of to what degree will there be a corporate strategy for how do we move forward, or will there be a community-based people strategy? And when I think of Chokwe in Jackson, I think of Roz in Newark. What comes out of their what they advocate as a platform is a peoples-based strategy that can sustain. But it seems that it's a really difficult challenge. Well, but you guys were able to, in Washington D.C., this is what I was trying to get to, to take a city government and make it work. Yeah.
Well, it was difficult. Well, now, but let me just be clear about this now. For all those years that we were in office, I had served 16 years in office here as a council member. The District of Columbia government never had enough money to pay its bills any of those years. Okay. We had to take nothing and make something out of it, because we knew our people were suffering so badly that we had to figure out how to juggle these things enough so that we could make it work. Right. This government now has a $750 million surplus. I mean, people go around now bragging about how much of a surplus they have. Well, you can have a surplus. Anybody can have a surplus if they don't do anything to help homeless people, if they don't do anything to provide employment for all these young people who are out of work. Right. It's like me saying I got plenty of money in the bank. I could have plenty. If I didn't pay my mortgage, I'd have plenty of money in the bank. Right. But I wouldn't have nowhere to stay either. So, so to some extent, I think we have to keep pushing them to do better, because they do have resources, and I do have. My career was spent. And all those years when they said I have a lot of money, but I still did a homestead housing program. We still did rent control laws that protected these properties. We still protected people who lived in these properties. We still put in circuit breaker tax legislation so people didn't get put out of a neighborhood just because the taxes went up, because the value of the property went up. If you've been living there for a long time, you ought to be able to stay there. So there are ways to do this. But you have to have the will, and the public just has to keep pushing our elected officials to make them do the right thing. But I think And I have a lot of faith that we have a lot of young people now coming to office in D.C., like Chokeway down there in Mississippi. These young people are smart, they're well educated, they come from good families, and I think they'll do well. I have a lot of faith in the future here. But let me say one other thing about these cities. The city, for most African Americans, have been sort of an enabling institution. People would leave the Mississippi Delta and go, where did they go? They went to Chicago. When my folks left Mississippi, Georgia, they went to Chicago. My mother's family went to Dayton. They didn't move to some rural area, they moved to a city. Why did they move to the cities? Because these cities were enabling institutions where they could walk in there, as you described to me earlier, you could walk into Ford Motor Company and get a job, get in line and get a job in 2 days. Because that's what they were there for. And they made a little money and they sent money back home to support their families and eventually moved their families here with them. So these cities were enabling institutions for black people who are coming out of slavery now with their newfound freedom, setting up these colleges and universities and churches and schools and things like that. And so when African Americans in Washington, D.C. talk about being displaced, they're not just talking about the fact that they have to move, because all of us moved. I moved from Georgia to get here. You moved from Michigan to get here. So all of us may have to move to do better, but we moved to a place where there were enabling institutions that were supporting us. We joined churches and schools and labor unions because those things helped us to better our lives and better our communities. That fabric is coming apart right now. And so when people get scared about being displaced, they're frightened because they know that whole network is coming apart. And without that network, they are frightened about whether they can themselves make it, and also whether their children are going to be able to sustain their same level of income and influence. And so there's good reason to be concerned about it. And I just wanted to say that because this is not an irrational response to something that it is a rational response from people who see their network and their support unit coming apart. That village that had helped them to go from poverty in rural Alabama to middle class in Washington, D.C. or Chicago or Dayton, Ohio has come apart. And so the government has to see this as a development strategy and find ways to put money there to retain those values that those institutions have provided for America as stepping stones for people who are trying to make a better life for themselves and their families. And I know I know those of us who, ain't nobody gonna look at that there and say we got any leadership like that coming from the White House at the moment. Leadership that's coming now is very different. But the federal government has provided a subsidy to farming communities all across America because it wanted to keep those farms alive, because they meant something to the country. They've got to look at these cities that same way, where they look at these cities as places that need to be kept alive because they mean something to the country.
No, I think that hits a lot on the head of where we're at, what the government is or is not doing, which I would step back and look at that one of the things that's happened in our lifetime has been a transition in government philosophy, where we grew up as still sort of the beneficiaries of the New Deal and then of the Great Society.
Right.
Somewhere along the way, 70s, 80s, the idea of a government that actually takes responsibility for the least of us.
Right.
That says there has to be a commitment to protecting people who are the most vulnerable went out the window.
Well,
And
let me challenge you on that a little bit, Professor, because I think that this public debate that's taking place now about health care
Right.
is interesting within that context, because they're debating a bill which was passed by the Obama administration, which provided a network of health care for low-income people and others, working and non-working people too. So one administration ago, the government put in a pretty progressive piece of legislation that is designed to take care of these people. Now you got a second administration here now trying to turn it around, and they're having a heck of a time trying to turn it around. Why? Because so many people benefit from it. And when those people wake up and realize that they're getting so much out of this, so I would say that as a professor of history or somebody who's looking at this for some kind of lens, the fact of the matter is we're in an interesting period now where there's a public debate going on right now about how much benefit this government is going to provide to people who need health care. in the
I-
United States?
I think absolutely very little. See, I would argue that the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was certainly a progressive step over what happened, but had severe limits.
Right.
And I would say that in the context of the difference between the right of people to have health care versus the right of people to have health insurance. So there's a big difference.
Right.
And I would say that President Obama was, and I use the term, he was a neoliberal Keynesian, meaning that while there were parts of the New Deal and the Great Society that he embraced, from the perspective of building it within the framework of corporate America, that put limits on exactly how far he would go. And so that the broader point I was trying to get was that since the 1980s, whether it's been Democrats or Republicans, the idea of the welfare state has eroded. And as you're pointing out now, the extreme of that is what we're seeing under the current administration. So my question is, how do we address the larger issue around governing philosophy and governing strategy?
Well, let me say to one of my roles now as a father and a grandfather is to try to provide not only advice and direction to my younger offsprings, but I also have to try to provide some sense of direction and optimism for the public.
Right.
So let me just say that although we're going through these devastating moments now in this discussion, the fact of the matter is we won the last election. We that coalition of African Americans and progressive whites and Hispanics and others, we polled more votes than they did.
That's exactly right.
So and we'll get them next time. Right. So and this is America. There's going to be another election. Right. This is not one of those places where they can cancel the election because they're scared they're going to lose. If you lived in one of these countries, some of these countries, you can't do that in America. We got better rules than that here in the United States. So there's going to be another discussion. So this whole debate now is taking place not only in the context of some legislation that was put in place by an African American president and his coalition, but it's also taking place within the context of another reality, which is that in a year and a half or 2 or 3, there's going to be another election. Right. So some of this damage that can be undone by these people here now, we can reverse. We're going to reverse it the first chance we get, because we want America to go another way. Those of us who believe in freedom and who believe in democracy believe, as Dr. King said, the moral arc of the universe has changed. And I'm paraphrasing here now. It has changed, and it bends toward justice. And I think we've passed that threshold here in the United States. And I think that that leadership which President Obama has provided and which the African Americans have provided here in the United States has enabled America to get into a place where we deal with this race issue better in the United States than they do in many of these other countries. We really do. I mean, I've been around the world now a couple of times. I've been in the civilization belt of Europe. I've been in the deserts of Africa. I've been on the safaris in South Africa. I've seen a lot. Right. We do better here in the African American community in the United States does better than it does anywhere in the world. We've got more doctors and lawyers and teachers and preachers and millionaires and billionaires because we've been fighting our tails off ever since we've been here, and we won't settle for nothing but the best, and we won't give up as long as we got a breath to breathe and we'll fight. And I think we've provided an image for people around the world that you can win some of these fights. You can't, if you got your soldiers in the field, they got to believe they can win sometimes. Right. If they don't believe they can win something, they're going to stop fighting because there's nothing for them to fight for. What they're fighting for is victory. Their idea of victory is on the other side of all of this, something good is going to happen. And when they stop believing that, they're going to stop fighting. So we got to keep our soldiers in the field because there is victory to be had. And we got to claim our victories a little bit at a time when we get them to get our soldiers ready for the next fight. And there's going to be another fight. There's going to be another election. There's also going to be another fight for African Americans because, I said I travel all around the world. African Americans are mistreated. Dark-skinned people, right? People who have dark skins, Indians, blacks, Africans, are mistreated around the world, and many of them in their own countries. And so this issue of race is something that we're just having to wrestle with worldwide. And I think we've got to continue this thing. And I think, we've made progress on it here, progress that I think has emboldened other people around the world, emboldened them to believe that they can make progress in their own communities too. And I think that's been the essence of this fight. I'm happy to play the role in it, and I think the Black Power Chronicles is going to do a good job of explaining this to the rest of the world.
Well, I have to say, Dr. Smith, it's been a pleasure and an honor, and I appreciate the optimism. I think you're absolutely right. You can't progress unless you believe you can progress.
That's right.
And the optimism is critical. So
Right.
thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
All right.
All right.